Hello everyone. In this video, we will be reviewing Anthropology in Antiquity to the Middle Ages. We'll be guided by our review of the text by Erickson and Murphy, The Early History of Anthropological Theory. So in today's video, we'll be reviewing anthropology primarily in Antiquity up to the Middle Ages. And then in the next video, we'll talk about the Middle Ages, the Renaissance, and move from there to the voyages of discovery and eventually the scientific revolution. Anthropology was a nascent thought or concept and intellectual tradition very early in antiquities. So anthropology has its roots in the intellectual world of the ancient Greeks and to some extent the Romans. There's a lengthy and rich history of thought that contributes to anthropology thousands of years, a couple thousand years before it became a scientific discipline. So let's review some of these tenets that we can see, basic foundations of anthropology going back into antiquity. The Greco-Roman intellectual traditions really form the basis of all of Western science, and so sociology and anthropology, thoughts about human culture and collective consciousness, have their roots in the Greco-Roman tradition. There's some quasi-scientific attributes which may surprise you, and we'll review some of these. We'll talk about Thales and some of the pre-Socrates and Plato cosmologists who were trying to figure out nature and the universe and our place in the world. They were surprisingly materialistic, that nature over supernatural explanations predominate in these early thinkers. There's several humanistic and religious thinkers as well. So we'll see the foundations of both the natural sciences in today's video, and we'll also see some of the foundations of the humanistic approaches that emerge as well. So we'll talk about Thales, Homer, Virgil, and some of the other early thinkers. The pre-Socrates scientists or naturalists, Thales primarily, the Greek philosopher who lived about 640 to 546 BC. Thales speculated that everything in the world originated from water. So early on, he is looking to the elements to try to figure out where organisms and life came from. Thales developed early geometry, which served the sciences very well. Part of natural sciences is geometry. So Thales, or the theorem that Thales developed was that if there are 3 points on a perfect circle, point A, B, and C, then if line A and C goes straight across that circle or measures the diameter of that circle, then the angle for A, B, and C is always a right angle. So sometimes this is called the Pythagoras theorem, but Thales is credited for developing it. And in celebration of this great discovery, Thales is said to have sacrificed an ox in honor of the great achievement. Anaximander was a student of Thales and picked up where Thales had left off. He was an early proponent of science and a keen observer of the universe around him. He argued that the original substance of the cosmos was not a known element, but something boundless and undifferentiated. Empedocles wrote a poem on nature. Empedocles is credited as being an ancient precursor to Darwinian theory. Long before Darwin or evolutionary thought had taken off in Europe, Empedocles was working on these types of questions. He believed that the cosmos evolved as different constituent elements that encountered one another and formed together larger bodies, and these larger bodies survived only if they were useful in nature. So you can see in Empedocles' thinking some very early similarities to our understanding of atoms and molecules and how organisms are constructed out of these basic elements of the cosmos. So this concept of the bodies that formed were only survived if they were useful is vaguely similar to the concept of natural selection. These theories described causation, were based on perception, and their thought about what was being observed. So they were working on explaining terrestrial phenomenon and biological processes very early on. Empedocles argued for 4 basic elements, so expanding from simply water that Thales was interested in. Empedocles looked at fire, air, earth, and water, the 4 basic elements, and established that these elements were the makings of the structures of our world and everything in it. So this became standard dogma for the next 2,000 years. Travel writing becomes popular as the ancient Greeks explored beyond their borders and encountered people that were not Greek. They wondered why people were different from each other. So Herodotus in the 5th century BC is credited as being the father of history and to some extent of ethnography in anthropology as well. Herodotus observed diversity in races, in languages, and in cultures, and he documented these through his travel writings. He tried to explain what people were doing objectively and attempted to remove his biases of his own Greek culture. So there was an attempt to make these descriptions non-ethnocentrically. So this correlated cultures to their locations. So Herodotus actually took somewhat of a materialistic approach once again by arguing that people's languages and cultures were different because of the environments and their geographies and to some extent the climate in which they lived. So very progressive view by Herodotus. Herodotus was a humanist. So humans are the center of all things. He was an historian and he was a scientist. So these are ancient precursors to ethnographies or just writing of different ethnic cultures. Herodotus created an excellent, very early ethnographic description of a Babylonian wedding. In the 5th century BC, there was a shift towards democracy in ancient Greece, and this resulted in changes in their philosophy and approaches to inquiry. So a humanistic approach replaced that pragmatic pre-Christian era science of Thales and Empedocles. So they begin to teach practical skills for life. What was the point of education? To the sophists, the point of an education was to teach people how to live a moral and virtuous life. So more important than objective knowledge, and so you see the rise of humanistic approaches and the decline of naturalistic approaches. It's a thought. Protagoras is credited by saying, man is the measure of all things. So sophists were humanists. This statement is a purely humanist statement. Man is the measure of all things. They believed that human behavior was the result of individual circumstances, not necessarily something that is determined by the gods in advance. So you are responsible for your behavior. And behavior is a cultural convention. these are precursors to the anthropological concept of cultural relativism. Sophists were excellent at debate. Rhetorical and virtuous style of discourse flourished in their free democracy. For some, this led to a path that we would call nihilism. Nihilism is the doctrine that nothing is knowable, and Socrates is credited with saying that he knew nothing worthwhile. That was his defense at trial. These are precursors to the paradigm of postmodernism, which we will talk about in later videos. Knowledge is dictated by those that are in power and trickled down to the populations from there. These are precursors of Marxian theory, which we will also discuss in a subsequent video. These are contradictory to each other, though, and they began the practice of charging for education so that only the powerful and wealthy could benefit from education. So you have the rise of the professional teacher during this period, and tuition dollars have gone up ever since. Some of the thinkers were opposed to sophistry and thought that education should be free. Socrates began to speak about his philosophies on the street corner to whoever was willing to listen. And one of those people was his most famous student, Plato. Aristotle followed as a student then of Plato. So we get this great line of thinkers during the golden age of Greek philosophy: Socrates, Plato, and Aristotle. To summarize these three very briefly, if we can, Socrates believed in universal values existed. There was a way to live a pious life, and people must train their minds to do this. That means they must be educated. Education enabled people to see through cultural conventions and live a moral life. Plato believed that there were universal values that existed, and these were embedded in the human mind, sort of an operating system that we're born with. Ideas or essences of things were enduring in nature, and these impacted human behavior. He argued that there were ideal forms, and that these ideal forms were distorted by humans. He recognized that human perception was fundamentally flawed and people were biased, and education could help them to see through these distortions and get at the true forms that existed in nature. So remove the blurry perception of humans through the training of the mind through education. Aristotle argued that societies developed over time. He was more empirical, and he had this he argued that there was a relationship between human societies and nature again. So moving more towards that natural exploration of the natural world and materialistic explanations once again. So he has a legacy for including a scientific method in his pursuit of knowledge. So you start to see even early on in the ancient Greeks this pendulum that swings back and forth, left and right, between a materialistic explanation of the natural world and an idealistic explanation or humanistic explanation of the human mind. And paradigms tend to move back and forth. We'll see it throughout the history of our discipline. And that will help explain and help you to place different paradigms within the context of idealism and materialism. So I want to introduce you to Plato's Allegory of the Cave, because I think that Plato comes very close to our understanding of culture, of ethnicity, and how people's worldviews are shaped by their experiences. Plato argued that human perception is fundamentally flawed, and that our perceptions of the world are degenerative forms of an ideal world order that exists out there. This is not only true of ideas and thoughts, but of physical items that we encounter in our everyday lives in the world. So you may go outside and view a beautiful tree. Well, your perception of that tree is a distortion of one single ideal form of a tree that exists. So therefore, you have all these different kinds of trees. Now, this may be true of a cat or of a chair, and people go through their lives in this way. So he described it very prophetically, I would say, in the Allegory of the Caves. And I'll post several videos. There are several excellent YouTube videos that explain Plato's Allegory of the Caves in very creative forms. But the short of it is that all of us are initially in a cave, a metaphorical cave, as we go about our daily routines. And we have blinders on, so we can only see what is projected in front of us. And he described it as us being locked as prisoners in this cave facing a wall in front of us. Behind us, in a place we cannot see, is a large fire. And there are ideal shapes being marched in front of us, and that creates a reflection of those ideal forms on the cave wall. So imagine a movie theater where everybody is sitting fixed with their eyes locked on the screens in front of them, where images of real life are portrayed. We know it's not real life, but we perceive this movie much as if we are a character in the story. And then when you leave the cave or the movie theater, you're a little bit disoriented. Now, Plato argued that at some point, somebody broke loose of these chains and left the cave. And when they did, they saw sunlight and the actual real world. When that person tried to go back into the cave to explain to his fellow prisoners, they did not believe him. And that's an important item to consider. So our perceptions of the world are fixed and bounded by our experiences. And through education, Plato believed you could free yourselves of those binds, take off those blinders, and see what he considered the true ideal world order. So some other ways to summarize Plato's allegory of the cave, also known as the theory of forms. Enlightenment, philosophical enlightenment, can reveal true knowledge, but you must first leave the cave and remove the binders that restrict your perceptions. So you can see how Socrates and Plato were agitators of the world order. And it's probably by no coincidence that Socrates was convicted and executed for corrupting the youth. The Stoics came along and believed that nature and society were highly ordered, that there was a natural cosmic order that they called the logos, or logic. Universal order made cross-cultural comparisons possible. These are precursors to what we know as the social sciences today, comparative cross-cultural comparisons. The Stoics, which emerged towards the end of the ancient Greek philosophers and dominate Roman philosophy, was perfect for Romans because of the rhetorical style, perfect for Roman politics of debate and informed exchange and conversation. So some quotes here that kind of summarize the Stoics or Stoicism. The purpose of life is happiness, which is achieved by virtue, living according to the dictates of reason, and ethical philosophical training, self-reflection, and careful judgment, and inner calm. So through education comes enlightenment. So everybody can just keep calm and carry on, a Stoic sort of philosophy. Stoics believed in a tabula rasa, or a blank slate, that we are born like a blank hard drive, or in their case, a chalk slate. And it's up to us to write our story on that slate, or to fill our minds with knowledge. So human infants that are born are innocent, and they begin to absorb the knowledge around them. This helps explain why a baby born within one culture will adopt the cultural norms and the language of that society. But a baby born in one culture and moved immediately to another culture through adoption or something will absorb and learn the cultures, traditions, and language of that new society, and not that of the birth parents. So the blank slate model. During the decline of the Roman era, Christianity builds from Stoicism and this idea of an ideal world order. So Emperor Constantine makes Christianity the state religion of Rome, moves the capital over to Constantinople, Istanbul, and during this period, St. Augustine writes the text in 425 AD called the City of God, which is a first attempt at explaining the natural world in a text that's something other than the Bible. So this is some of the very beginnings of the Middle Ages. The Bible and Augustinian philosophy were really the only texts available in Europe. And you'll remember Bishop Ussher tried to calculate the history of humanity using the book of Genesis and Augustinian texts. He did an excellent, very thorough examination of the evidence he had available to him, but calculated that humans were created in 4004 BC based on these knowledges. So church doctrine, Augustinian philosophy dominate the Middle Ages. There's really they're really not that conducive to science at that point, but we'll see how some of that changes as the Middle Ages go on. St. Thomas Aquinas comes along. The major tenets of this period, though, were that really said that God was perfect and humans were not. Humans are flawed, they're sinners. And so because God created earth and nature, everything was as he wanted it, and humans were imperfect. So this set the stage for a long period of the immutability of earth, which meant that species didn't change, the earth didn't change, because it was created in a perfect way. So there was no purpose in studying the natural world because that's the way that God wanted it. So everything people should know was contained in the Bible. So Augustinian Christianity develops during the Middle Ages, mostly during the Dark Ages, 5th through the 15th centuries or so. It stressed the importance of a universal history of humans. We all came from one place and were degenerative forms of a more perfect ideal. So it laid this broad foundation of the temporal and spatial comparisons, or cross-cultural perspectives, that helped to produce the discipline of anthropology hundreds of years later. It kept some knowledge alive in the form of Latin, but most people forgot Latin, or how to read Latin and how to write, so a lot of people were illiterate, but those that were in the hierarchies of the church, so the Bible was read to people. That's why people congregated in masses, so that they could hear the written word read by somebody who was able to read it. So history was taught as really only as a way that humans could come to know more about Christianity. And history was seen as lineal, or a common history of nations, that all nations came from a common source, which was dictated by religious dogma. Universities do begin, though, and university is a community of teachers and scholars. It's from the Latin word universitas. Some of the very earliest universities to be formed and that are still in existence today, the University of Bologna, which was founded in 1088 AD, it's still there. University of Paris, formed in 1150 AD, although it is not a central university anymore. There are several universities of Paris scattered around the city, and then Oxford University, founded in AD 1167. These are three of the oldest universities in the world, and they're formed during the Dark Ages. So it's several hundred years before universities really begin to expand their scope. So some of the central concerns of the Middle Ages were, how does the world work? What is the natural order of things? And what is the role of humans in that? What is humanity? Why do we exist? How come we are able to reflect on nature? Is it right to question the natural order or to explore the parameters of nature? Why are we here as humans? How come we are intelligent beings in this natural place? Why are we different, or are we even different than other animals? These are primary questions that begin to emerge during the Middle Ages. So we'll talk more about the Middle Ages and the Dark Ages and how those came to an end in the next video. Thank you all for your attention.